I had a splendid voice. In fact, I'd sing in opera if they'd give me my choice. I wrote to Oscar Hammerstein that I would be his star. He said, come down and sing for me, and I'll see how good you are. And I don't suppose I'll do it again for months and months and months. No, I don't suppose I'll do it again for months and months and months. I sang the wise old owl, and he left the room at once. So I don't suppose I'll do it again for months and months and months.
Welcome to the Recluse's Cookbook Series 3. I'm your host, Vinny McHale. For anyone returning from the previous seasons, you're very welcome back, and for anyone who is new to the podcast, thanks a million for popping by. Remember, if you enjoy what you hear, then please like and share. This episode marks the second part of the interview with Austin Stack. Austin is a former assistant prison governor and author. His book, Justice for My Father, was published in 2025 and is available in all good bookshops. The first part of our interview covered the events leading up to and the night Brian Stack was shot and wounded in Dublin. In that episode, Austin set the background of the times they lived in while documenting how his father had become a thorn in the side of the Republican prisoners. The second half of this interview takes us into the territory of the campaign for justice for his father. Austin details the events that took place, trying to get the answers for the horrible crime perpetrated upon his father and his family. He tells us about his challenging the Sinn Féin leadership and how his young son pointed out a crucial fact about when people tell lies again and again. Ladies and gentlemen, without further ado, I give you Austin Stack.
We had trusted the guards, okay? And even up to the point where the serious crime review, when I got all this evidence that I realised they had and they hadn't disclosed to us, we still trusted the guys to do their job. And when the serious crime review team came on board, we had a huge element of trust that they would find something. And where relationships kind of broke down, really, we became aware that very early on, the superintendent in charge of the serious crime review team told us that the deputy governor in Portlaoise was someone that had been mentioned to the Gardaí by every person they spoke about in relation to the case. And it was quite extraordinary. They told us that they had managed to put a name on every seat in the stadium that night. And we questioned them and said, how did you manage that? And they were kind of going, well, if Austin was with Mick, we knew Austin was at the box, and we'd say, well, who are you with? And I'd say I was with Mick and John. And then they would interview Mick and John, and they might say, well, we know that Joe was there as well, and they'd go interview Joe, and they were able to patchwork quilt the tallest. And at the time, it was very funny. My brother Oliver had been he was teaching in Port Arlington at the time, and he was in having lunch in this pub, and the publican came out and sat down beside him, and he said, look, he says, just to say to you, he says, look, I hear you're looking for the case to be reinvestigated. He said, I was in the stadium that night. And he said, I was there with the Port Arlington Boxing Club. But he said, there was a guy sitting behind me, and he was a guard from Portlaoise. So he named him, and my brother Oliver rang me, and he says to me, is he related to the deputy governor? And I said, well, I'll have to ask my mother that. I don't know this guy. My mother said to me, oh, yeah, he's high up in the guards. And when I Googled it, then I discovered he was an assistant commissioner. And like, you couldn't make it up. You would think that I was some sort of one of these cracked conspiracy theorists if I had to just tell you that. Well, and when they told us they'd put a name on all the seats and they'd interviewed everyone that was there, my brother Oliver said to him, so you've interviewed the assistant commissioner then? And the guards were not impressed at all. And the superintendent, he kind of got a bit angry with us, and he said, oh, that man was there at the boxing with his son. And we kind of go, well, we didn't say he wasn't. We just know that he was there. So I'm assuming you said you've interviewed everyone that you know was there. So I'm assuming you've interviewed him. And we quickly became aware that we had requested that deputy governor be interviewed by the the investigate the serious crime review team, and they told us they would do it, and they kept telling us they were going to interview him, and then they told us that they had received a sick cert from him, that he was too ill to be interviewed. The night that they told us that, my mother saw him down at my uncle's public house in Portlaoise. So he wasn't too ill to have a pint, but he was too ill to be interviewed. At that, I got a journalist to doorstep him, and he told the journalist that he had received no requests to be interviewed by the Gardaí, but that he had no problem. At the time he said, my short-term memory is not good, but my long-term memory is quite good. I have no problem doing an interview. And then the crux of it came. He said, if there was a cert sent in, it must have been somebody from my family did it. So I remember we went to a meeting with the Gardaí and with the assistant commissioner and the superintendent, and they said to us, I know you have suspicions about everything. And I said, look, the bottom line is, it's a fact that the the the, the murder wasn't being investigated very quickly after, after about 2 months into it. It's a fact that you've told us that the deputy governor is under suspicion. It's a fact that his son is an assistant commissioner. It's a fact that there was a sick cert put in for him. And I said, so if you're in our shoes, I said to him, what would your suspicion be? And I said, that's all I'm saying. I'm not making an allegation, but I said, I'm just giving you the facts and saying to you, this is what we know. And, that's where we have to say we are suspicious. So the NBCI, the National Bureau of Criminal Investigation, took on the case then, and we had lost a little bit of faith in the Gardaí, and it was around 2011, I think it was January 2011 or 2012, 2012. I talk about this in the book, where the inspector that had been appointed as our liaison came in to see me. I was working in Wheatfield prison at the time, and he came in after work, and I was able to kind of, my office in Wheatfield was kind of a quiet place where I could have a chat with someone like that after hours, So he came in to see me, and he told me that it was the Gardaí's view that the IRA had not murdered my dad. That his words were, I looked senior members of that organisation in the whites of their eyes, and I can tell you now, I do not believe that they carried out this attack. I say the least, I was not impressed, because I knew that this was an attack on the state. Okay, you were talking 1983 at the height of the Troubles, right? There was very few. If it had to be Dublin criminals carried out the attack, word would have filtered back to the Gardaís through informants and stuff like that. This was an attack where the motorbike was robbed a month beforehand. We know that my dad was followed twice in the month beforehand when he went to the National Stadium in Dublin. We know that there was at least 6 senior IRA people in the vicinity of the stadium that night. We know that they dumped the bike and there was a car then to take them out of the city. So this was a well-planned operation. This was not a Mickey Mouse job. And the only ones that had the motive for doing this would have been the IRA. They were the only ones, the motive, the ability, and the resources to carry out this. And I said to him, I said to this guard inspector, just get out of my office. I don't want to ever see you guys again. And at that stage, I decided that the only way that I could get the IRA, I needed to get the IRA to admit that they did this, and then go back to the Gardaí and say, "Now I told you so." And Jerry Adams made a statement in the Dáil in relation to the murder of Adrian Donohoe, Garda Adrian Donohoe, and he he caught everybody off guard when he was talking about that, and he just kind of came out with this out of the blue, and he said, "I also want to apologize um, uh, to the families of all those in the state forces in the Republic of Ireland who were killed during the Troubles by the IRA." So I wrote an article in the Independent the following day, and I kind of the questions I had were quite simple. Who was Jerry Adams actually apologizing to? Because the IRA, their Green Book, the standing order of their Green Book, they stated that they could not engage in action against the state forces in the Republic of Ireland. The IRA had denied all of those murders of Gardaí, Private Paddy Kelly, and my dad. So my question was, who was he actually apologizing to? Because they denied all these murders. And I said in the article that I'd like to meet Jerry Adams to discuss these issues. And I got no response. Um, I had put a few requests out via social media looking for him to meet me, no response. So I decided that the only way I could do this was to entrap um, I knew with their political campaign that they had put in place around the country a lot of bear in mind that this is 2013. They'd put in place an awful lot of new candidates around the country who were not in any way connected with the Troubles. Okay, and one of them was in Portlaoise, and he'd got elected to the Dáil just before that. And in 2011, when Martin McGuinness was in the presidential campaign and he came to Portlaoise, the first question he was asked by a reporter was, "What about the Brian Stack murder?" And Brian Stanley, new Sinn Féin TD, was trying to impress Adams or McGuinness, and he jumped in to defend McGuinness and said, "Look, the IRA had nothing to do with that." And that became the headline in the Laois Nationalist newspaper. So I put a plan together that around the 30th anniversary of the shooting in March 2013, I was going to do a round in media, and I spoke with the producer of the Midlands 103 morning show, and I said to her, "Look, would Will Faulkner have me on?" I said, "I've sent out the press release." She said, "Yeah, he'll have you on Monday." And I said, "Look, just tell him that I'm going to be referencing the front of the Laois Nationalist from whatever date it was in November 2011. And I said, just make sure Will has that." And so she did. And when I was on, I said, "Look," I said, "I want to meet Jerry Adams. I want to talk to Jerry Adams about this." Because I said, one of his TDs, our local TD here in Laois, has stated that the IRA had nothing to do with this. And I said, he stated that, and it's on the front of the Laois Nationalist from such a date. And I said, if Brian Stanley can categorically say the IRA had nothing to do with the murder of my dad, he must have some information in relation to the murder. And as a public representative, he has duty to go to the Gardaí with whatever information that he has. Now, I knew by throwing out that fishing line that Stanley will come on the hook. He had to respond to that. And he came back on, he looked for a right response. He came on the radio program and he tried to waffle his way out of it and say that it was his belief. And Will Faulkner's a very good journalist. Will said, "No, I'm looking at the newspaper here. There's a direct quote from you. It doesn't say, I believe the IRA. It says the IRA had nothing to do with that." And he says, all that man wants is to speak to your leader. How is he going to do that? And Stanley then says, "Well, if he sends him an email." So I sent Adams an email straight away. And then that's how we got to meet with Adams. This was kind of in around kind of April time. And I knew that Adams was going to be on prime time in early May, and he was going to be questioned about my dad's murder. He denied again on that primetime interview. I went to see him in June then, and he told me that myself and my brother went in to see him, and when we went in to see him the first time, he was in Dáil Éireann, and we had done an interview with the media outside, and Helen O'Donoghue, she's a reporter with 6-1 News, had asked me, what did I want from the meeting with Adams? And I said, look, I want him to sit down with his movement and people within his movement and try and get me some answers as to what went on. At this stage, I had information from one source about the names of the specifics of the names of the people involved. So I wanted that backed up, and I wanted the IRA to admit what they'd done. And she asked me, you know, who are you talking about type thing. And I said, well, look, there's people sitting around the Sinn Féin parliamentary party, like Martin Ferris and Desi Ellis, who were in Portlaoise at the time. And I said, I'm sure Jerry Adams could talk to them and they might be able to give him some information. So we went into the meeting. And when myself and my brother Oliver went into the meeting with Adams, he tried to intimidate us. He was sitting nonchalantly in the chair with his arm over the back of the chair. And when we went in, he kind of looked us up and down and he went, oh my God, you're very brave men to come in here and see me. And
That's a
it was
strange thing to
no
say to someone, isn't it?
intimidation. It was pure intimidation. And I looked at him and I just said to him, look, deputy, because I refused to call him Jerry. I just said, look, deputy, I've been in Dáil Éireann 1,001 times before in my life. And I said, I've no difficulty coming in here and seeing you in your place of work. So I said, then he tried a different track and he said to me, oh, we're all victims here. My sister's husband was shot or something like that. And at that stage, I knew he was going to play the victim card. And I had said to my brother Oliver, when he does that, I'm going to go for him. And I did this kind of fake anger thing where I thumped the desk and jabbed the finger at him. And I told him in no uncertain terms what a victim was. And then I stopped. And he was kind of sitting up rigid in the seat. And I said, no. I said, I'll have your attention. And I just completely changed my tone. And I said, I'm here to do business with you. I'm here to try and see if we can work something out. So all I'm asking you to do is talk to people within your organization and see what you can find out for me. And he says, you're saying in the media that you know who done it. Do you want to tell me? And I said, no. I said, I'm not here to discuss names with you. And that became a bone of contention a number of years later in a kind of a he said, she said thing where he said I gave him names at that stage. But in their they released minutes of that meeting that we didn't know they'd taken, and they in an email, which was published in the papers afterwards. I have quoted it in the book, and I show the piece from the newspaper, the book, where the question that Adams asked me, do you want to tell me? I said, no, I'm not here to discuss names with you. And they actually admit that in that email. But anyway, he went away himself, and he had this guy Richard McCauley with him, who's his press officer. And they went outside, and they left myself and Oliver in the room, and they came back in maybe 20 minutes later, and they were obviously after discussing it with themselves, and they said, look, we can do business with you. And he did say to us that they had seen the TV interview because it had been played on 6-1 when they went outside. And he said, I'm just asking you, he said, not to discuss the names of the people that you discussed on the TV, because they are some of the people I have to go back and talk to. And that's fine. And as we were walking away from Leinster House that evening, he rang me and he said to me, look, just give me a month. And he said, I would ask you to keep off the airwaves, not to be going to the media for about a month on this.
Now, what's crucial here, Austin, on this, and what I really liked about your book, because you point something about telling the lie often enough. Can you tell us a little, because this is crucial to what happens next in this particular
Yeah.
story. Can you explain that for our listener? Because I think it's something that we hear and we see all the time, but we don't actually understand what is happening. Could you elaborate on that for us, please?
Yeah. So before I went into meeting for that meeting, I was studying. I was told by some journalists to record interviews that Adams does and to study him and to watch how he answers questions. He slows down the clock. he tries to make himself the victim. Okay. But when I was doing that, the interview he did with Primetime it was the April in 2013, and he kept denying that he knew anything about my dad's murder. And my son Freddie was 9 years of age at the time, and Freddie was sitting beside me, and I kept rewinding and going back over the thing and watching and just taking notes and stuff. And my son Freddie looked up at me and he goes, "Daddy, that man says he knows nothing about Grandad Brian's murder. Why don't you believe him?" And like this penny went, the penny just dropped in my head when that happened. I said, "My God, that's what these guys do. They keep deny. And if you tell a lie often enough, it becomes the given common sense, if you like. It becomes accepted if it's not challenged. And here was my 9-year-old son, uh, and he was actually getting sucked in by the lie because he kept saying it, and he was so plausible in the way he was saying it that um, my son was believing it. It just the penny dropped with me that time that you have to challenge everything with them. Now, I mean, I got to a point where I had written an article about Martin McGuinness in 2011 when he was running for the presidency, and it was quite bitter, and I put it away, and I went back to it a number of days later, and I basically I toned it down a bit, and the Indo published it, and a friend of mine rang me, and she said to me, "Oh my God, Austin, that was very bitter." And I said, "You should have seen the first draft." But she said to me, "You got to learn about forgiveness." And she was coming from a religious perspective, and I just said to her, "Look, leave all that rubbish out, will you?" At this stage, I was quite bitter, and I remember Martin McGuinness when he was on the Vincent Brown show, and when he was running for the presidency, and Vincent Brown asked him, how did he sleep at night? And he said, quite well. And if I could have pulled him through the television that night, I would have done it. And because I wasn't sleeping well, my sleeping patterns were all over the place. But when my friend spoke to me about forgiveness that evening, I was driving home, and again, it was like a bolt out of lightning that kind of struck me, and and I can still remember where I was on the road, and this thought just came to me: if I can forgive them, not for them, but for me, so going to say to them, "You did this. You take responsibility for it. So I'm taking the monkey off my back and giving it back to you. There you go. You deal with it now. You were the monkey. It's your problem. You did this. You're responsible for this. I'm forgiving you. Now go away with yourself." And what it meant for me was that I wasn't bitter anymore. I could sleep at night. I could challenge them in a very constructive way about what they did without being bitter or without getting all riled up about it. And I can go into it. I mean, I've met these people at, Oireachtas committee meetings and stuff like that, and sat down beside them, and you know, no difficulty doing that because I'm not bitter with them. What I do want them to do is to take responsibility for their actions, which they still today they peddle this what they call the no alternative mantra. And I was reading something yesterday in Twitter even that says that there's something like 85% of Catholics up in Northern Ireland now today believe that there was no alternative. But if you look back at the time when the Troubles was ongoing in Northern Ireland, Sinn Féin were not the dominant party on nationalism. The SDLP were, and Sinn Féin were probably getting about maybe 30% of the nationalist vote and the national support at the time. So, it just shows you how over time, we had the Good Friday Agreement in 98, that in those intervening years, Sinn Féin have been able to manipulate the narrative into this room. It's like they romanticize what went on. You see a lot of short videos and short films, and these guys, they're like cuddly grandfathers, and they're telling their war stories, and they romanticize the whole thing, and it can be quite annoying. And that was one of the reasons why I actually wrote the book. But if I go back to the story that when we met Adams, and one of the key things was to try and, as you say, you tell the lie often enough. Adams arranged for myself and my brother to go and meet with a senior IRA figure. We were asked to supply a list of questions. We were asked to leave our mobile phones behind us. We were initially told that the guy was very wary we would be wired, and I said, look, we'll submit to a search, that won't be a problem. And then he asked us, would we have an issue going across the border? And I said no. My brother Oliver said yeah, he would. And I asked Adams to give us a minute. He gave us a minute, and I said to Oliver, look, Adam's going to be with us. If that happens and we go across the border, it's on his head, essentially. So I said, we need to get them to admit to this. So I said, we have to do whatever it takes. So Oliver agreed. Adam came back. We discussed it with him again. So then he said to us, look, we'll do it on the southern side of the border. So then it was in late July, we were given a kind of a weekend. We're told keep all of that weekend free. And we got the call the night before. We went to the Regency Airport Hotel. We were to be in the lobby at 11 o'clock in the morning. Richard McCauley, who was Adams' press officer, turned up about 20 past 11. And he told us, look, lads, we're moving this. You got to follow me. So we followed him. We were in my car. We followed him up to the City North Hotel in Drogheda on the motorway. And there, Adams was at his own car standing beside it. And we parked up our car. We got into the back of Adams's car. Macaulay got into the driver's seat and Adams was in the passenger seat. We took off up the motorway, up towards Dundalk. And Adams turned around and he told us that we were going to get an admission. Okay. So he had said to us that this guy that we were going to meet was a friend of his and that he had asked him to carry out an investigation. And this was a senior IRA commander. And when we got to Dundalk, we came up off the slip road at the last exit towards the Ballymascanlon roundabout, and we headed off to the left. And we came to this, what I now know to be Foggart Cemetery, and it's quite a historical place. The last High King of Ireland is buried there. And there's a small car park outside it, and there was a Ford Transit van there with Northern Ireland plates on it, and a small kind of a tubby fella standing beside the van. And we walked over to the van, myself and Adams and Macaulay and my brother Ollie. And the guy opened the van door and we all got in the back. And it was unreal. There was plyboard. It was fit to measure to fit, screwed into the windows, screwed into the portion between the cab and the back. There was seats that had been made to fit into the back of this high-ace van or Ford Transit van. And so when the door was shut, we were in complete darkness. And we were driven for about 10 minutes. And we came to a house. And all I'll say to you is the van was obviously, I would imagine, used for operations of some description. It wasn't the first time the van was used. I put it that way. They didn't make this van just for our trip, but the driver, my God, he expertly drove that van right up through. So we went to a bungalow, and I just want listeners to imagine that you're in a bungalow and you have a sliding patio door coming out of the kitchen of the bungalow, and this guy drove the van to within a millimeter of that door. I could not describe it as, but only being that close. And somebody inside the house opened the sliding patio door and then opened the sliding van door. So we stepped straight from the van into the kitchen and you could not see around. It was done with that level of expertise. And we went into the kitchen and there was the owner of the house was there. and Adams introduced us to him, and there was a lot of scones and sandwiches and stuff on the table, and then we were brought through French doors into the front room, and there was a guy there who I now know who he was. He's guy was in kind of like his early 60s. He looked like a school teacher, looked like an English teacher with a sports jacket and leather patches on the elbows and that. One of them types. And he
Yeah.
was times, and he was uncovered. He was just like a normal bloke. And he introduced himself as John. He said, "That's my name for the purpose of the meeting. That's definitely not his name because I know who he is now." And he Richard Macaulay stayed in the kitchen with the owner of the house, and Adams joined us in the front room. And the guy read out a statement, and the statement was basically, it was done around the questions we had asked, okay, that we had supplied. He was answering a lot of those questions. Obviously, we had follow-on questions. So in the book, I go through the whole statement in the book, what was in it. But essentially, they admitted that someone with a leadership role in the IRA had authorized the attack on my dad, and that they had got their unit of volunteers to carry out the attack. And they said it hadn't been sanctioned by the Army Council. Now, I was very aware that that was not correct, and that's not how the IRA operated. And, I challenged Adams on all this. And at the meeting, I said to him, that's not correct. And he said, well, we didn't know for 3 years that it was our people who were involved. And I said to him, and he said then that that individual had been disciplined that authorized it. And I said to him, look, there's no way you weren't sitting in, Sinn Féin headquarters the following morning after this attack and not say, well, our guy's not involved in that. So that didn't happen. I said, he said to me, oh, well, it could have been the INLA or it could have been Dublin criminals. And I kind of said what I said to you earlier. If it was Dublin criminals, word would have come out, would have leaked out through informants and stuff. And
I
I
think
said,
it's too. I think it's actually worth pointing out here. Uh, Dublin Gangland didn't really do hits back then, did they?
no,
It was very rare. Like I mean, non-existent. The
it,
closest that would have been was the forensic scientist who was blown up by Martin Cahill. That was probably the first one I would have thought by Dublin criminals.
yeah, mostly at that time, you had the heroin epidemic was taking hold in Dublin. The late 70s, early 80s. There would have been a lot of bank robberies.
Hmm.
Um, but so, it was the Duns peddling heroin, and there was no real serious gangland stuff at the time. Like Hutchins hadn't even started doing the transit robberies and stuff
Yeah.
like that stage. So as you said, there was no gangland hits over drug territory and stuff like that. None that just wasn't a thing at the time. But we had been, it was quite clear to us that, when you're talking gangland stuff, there's always an informant who'll give up the information for time off a sentence or for, to be in the guard's good books. And when I said to him about the INLA, he said, I said they were just a ragtag organization that didn't really pull, a whole lot off. And he says to me, well, they pulled off Adrian Eve, didn't they? And I said, well, that was about the only big thing that they did during the Troubles that took a bit of planning or organization. And I said to him again, you guys had a motive. You wanted this double escape. You guys had the plan, and the plan that went into this was, the bike being robbed a month beforehand, the following of them on that bike for, on a couple of occasions, having a team coming in to take the two guys in the bike out of Dublin. So this was not, this was no ordinary operation. And he wouldn't admit to it. Now, I knew why, and I understood why, which, because the individual that had sanctioned it at that stage was a very extremely senior politician in Northern Ireland and had a senior role within Sinn Féin. And So I knew at that stage that, that's why they could, because if they had to admit that, then it would have meant their whole political project would have gone down the pan. So there was a reason why they couldn't admit that fully that it had been sanctioned. Um, but when Adams was very keen, I had said to him at the outset that I wanted to, I would be happy with a restorative justice approach if we could meet the individuals that murdered my dad and talk to them. And I said we were very much in favour of a truth and reconciliation process like that in South Africa. And he had said to me, well, look, we'd have to have amnesties before any of that could happen. And I said, look, well, the victims would never agree to amnesties happening at the start of the process. Because if you give somebody an amnesty at the start of the process, they have no reason to tell the truth then. And my suggestion to him was that you, if a family is the way you get around, he said, well, my people would be looking over their shoulder for the rest of their lives. And I said, well, the way that works is that anything that's said within the confines of a truth commission cannot be used then in evidence in a court case. And I said, if a family admits, or if a family decides that they've been dealt with truthfully, then they could recommend to the authorities that not to proceed with any charges and give the guy an amnesty. And
Hmm.
they approached with him, but Adam just was having none of that. And he did then want me to include a line in our statement that we didn't want any charges. And I said, no, I said, you didn't fully make the admission. And what I'd said to you was if we were dealt with and got all the information in a full and frank manner, the whole truth, then we would talk about something like that. But he tried me 2 or 3 times to put that into our statement. And I said, no, because we weren't given the full truth. Um, but interestingly, the week after, then the guards contacted me again, and they hadn't spoken to me for a number of years at that stage. And there was a new superintendent in charge of the case. And initially, I kind of fobbed them off and I said, look, where were you for the last number of years? And they said to me, well, we were kind of doing what you were doing, and we were trying to arrange to interview Adams, and you know, and I said, look, you guys had your chance. You guys told me that the IRA didn't do this. I have actually got the IRA to make an admission on this. So there you go. But subsequently, um, I got quite friendly with that superintendent. He was the one guard, I would say, of all the Gardaí that was the lead on the case, who I could say definitely tried to solve the murder. He really wanted to do this, and I had got some information from a very senior former Garda, and he had gotten information in relation with Dad's case around 1990 from an IRA informant, and he had put it on the file, he told me. And when I relayed that information to the Gardaí that were investigating the case, they told me that they didn't have that information. And I said to them, well, this guy's adamant. And when I told them who he was, they then went and interviewed him. And they came back, and that former deputy commissioner, he was an assistant commissioner at the time, John O'Driscoll, met with us and the investigation team, and they admitted that they now had that information, that it was on a file in crime and security, which is, for listeners, like Ireland's MI5. It's our intelligence. The state intelligence arm is run by the Gardaí out of the depot in Phoenix Park, and it's called Crime and Security. And the file that senior guard had been talking about was in crime and security, and they hadn't released it to the investigation team because there was an informant involved, and they didn't. As the superintendent in charge of the case said to me, well, we have a duty of care to the informant, and my brother Oliver said to him, well, he's a duty of care to my dad, you know. But there was I had to go into the media because they would not release the information to the team, and I went into the media And I said, look, one section of the guards wasn't cooperating with the other. The Gardaí eventually that primed them into some sort of action, and they came up with a solution to it, that crime and security, someone from crime and security would go and visit the informant and ask the informant would he be prepared to meet with the investigation team. And the word that came back was that this guy was too ill to be interviewed, that he would be of no value. It kind of sounded to me like he had Alzheimer's or something like that. But the crucial thing for us was that if they had to have that information that was on the file since 1990, a couple of years earlier, this individual would have been of use to the investigation. So you kind of like, I mean, that was the major flaw that the current investigation team came up against. We met with Drew Harris in 2019, and he gave us an apology. We asked for an apology, and he gave us an apology. He put that on the record then in the media, and then he wrote to us subsequently with the apology for the mishandling of 3 separate Garda investigations. Since then, a file went, the guy that actually organized the hit on my dad cannot be found. And the Gardaí told us that an alias that he uses came up on a driving stop in Canada in the early 2000s. And I subsequently got information. People come to me with information all the time, and I got information from a dissident Republican through a third source, through another source. Okay, the other source was the conduit of the information, because the dissidents want to make Sinn Féin and Adams look bad. Okay, so this information was that the guy that organized the whole thing was in Texas, and that he was living with a police officer. So I said this to the guards, and the guards said to me, "Oh, there's 50,000 police officers in Texas. You know, how are we going to narrow that one down?" And I just went back to my source and I said, "Look, by any chance," I said, "you know, the individual who gave you this information might be able to narrow this down a little bit?" And they came back to me and they said to me that he was living with a police sergeant. And it was the way it was said to me suggested that he was in a gay relationship. So, and that was kind of nodded to me. So I went back to the guards and I said, "Look, I want to narrow your 50,000 down slightly here. An Irish man in his 60s living in an openly gay relationship with a police sergeant in Texas narrows down your 50,000 considerably." And the Gardaí then went and they were able to see from Interpol, they got Interpol to look at flight records from Canada to Texas. And between 2000 and 2009, there was a lot of flights back and forth between Canada and Texas with this guy's alias on it. And they stopped in 2009 in Texas. So they were quite confident that the information I had was actually correct. And when they then told me they went to try and see if they could interview him and get him in Texas, and they had to organize that through the FBI. And they said to me when they went to Texas that he had been spooked and he was gone missing again. Now, the guy that pulled the trigger is living quite openly in the northeast of the country, in Ireland. You know, the Gardaí have, without all that material, the material evidence, I talk about this in the book, that they had the fingerprints, the helmet, all that sort of stuff. They told us that the fingerprint archive was flooded and that the fingerprints were washed away. I then suggested that they go back and get the evidence and take the fingerprints back off the evidence again. And I said, there could be potential DNA on the helmet. And they came back to me and told me that all that stuff was missing. They couldn't find it. So so that's another mishandling that the Gardaí have done in relation to the case, mislaying all the evidence. Without hard evidence, it's very difficult for them to charge anyone. Now, there was a fine went to the DPP in relation to the individual in Texas, and that came back from the DPP last year. They were just looking for some more information. So that's where the case is at the moment. We have gotten the IRA to admit that they did it, which was a big thing for us, but we're still chasing. We've asked the state to make a public apology, a state apology in relation to the mishandling, considering that the Garda Commissioner has issued us an apology, considering that the prison service bestowed upon my dad the prison service bravery award for the work that he was doing in the prison at the time. So that's basically the story to date.
That concludes my interview with Austin Stack. Please see all links relating to Austin and his work down below and check them out. You will not be disappointed. We'll be back in a fortnight with our next guest. Until then, please like and share where and when you can. Thank you for listening. Until next time.